Four brothers paid $20 a head for wives out of a paper catalog. They expected sturdy women to churn butter and keep the winter chill at bay. They didn't expect the train to spit out four women who shared the same eyes, the same desperate past, and the same last name. The 310 out of St. Louis ran 40 minutes late. The delay didn't bother the Hale brothers. They had spent the last 5 years waiting for rain, waiting for the cattle market to turn, waiting for the bank to look the other way. Another 40 minutes on the sun-baked planks of the Coulter's station platform meant nothing. Elias, the eldest, stood closest to the tracks. He was 32, built like a fence post, and possessed a face that looked as if it had been carved from old hickory and left out in the weather. Beside him leaned Caleb, nursing a bum knee and a sour disposition. Judd sat on a crate of horseshoes, rolling a cigarette with one hand. Seth, the youngest at 22, paced. "You think they're all on this one?" Seth asked, kicking a pebble onto the tracks. "Letter said the 14th, Elias muttered. He didn't look away from the horizon, where a smudge of black smoke was finally rising above the scrub oak they had sent away for them in March. It wasn't a romantic endeavor. It was a brutal practical calculation. The Hale Ranch spanned 4,000 acres of unforgiving Montana dirt. They needed hands. They needed a garden, a kitchen that didn't turn out charred meat, and eventually sons. So they pooled their money, placed 4 separate advertisements in a matrimonial paper back east, and picked 4 separate replies. The train roared into the station, hissing steam and spitting cinders. The brakes screamed. The platform shuddered. Elias stepped forward. He felt the heavy, unfamiliar weight of the folded letter in his vest pocket. He didn't know much about the woman coming for him, only that she claimed to be 28, a spinster, and unafraid of hard work. The passenger car doors clattered open. A conductor hopped down, placing a wooden step on the dirt. First came a leather trunk, dropped unceremoniously into the dust. Then another. Then 2 more. A woman stepped out. She wore a dark, heavy wool dress utterly unsuited for the late August heat. Her jaw was set, her posture rigid. She had dark hair pulled back so severely it looked painful, and pale eyes that swept the platform like a hawk scanning for field mice. Following close behind her was a second woman, taller, with a sharper nose and a mouth drawn in a thin, cynical line. She carried a battered carpet bag. A third woman emerged. She was slighter, her shoulders hunched. She kept her gaze pinned to the wooden step as she descended. Finally, the fourth. Younger, brighter in the face, though her skirts were just as worn and hemmed with the same cheap thread as the others. The train blew its whistle, the conductor tipped his hat, and within 2 minutes the locomotive was pulling away, leaving the 4 women standing beside their luggage in a cloud of sulfur and dust. Elias frowned. He looked at Caleb. Caleb was already squinting, his brow furrowed. They weren't just 4 women. They were 4 women carved from the exact same bone structure. Different heights, varying shades of dark hair, different ways of holding themselves. But the resemblance was undeniable. They shared the same high cheekbones, the same sharp, pale eyes. Elias stepped up. His boot struck the wood with heavy, deliberate thuds. He stopped 6 feet from the eldest-looking one, the first who had stepped off. "I'm looking for a Miss Cora Brennan," Elias said. His voice was a low gravel drag. The woman lifted her chin. "I am Cora Brennan." Elias nodded once. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the woman beside her. "And who's she?" "Abigail Brennan," the tall one said. Her voice had a bite to it, like a snapped wire. Seth stopped pacing. Judd crushed his half-rolled cigarette in his palm. "Jane Brennan," the quiet one whispered, clutching her shawl. "And I'm Lucy," the youngest said. She offered a tight, nervous smile that vanished almost instantly. Silence fell over the platform. The only sound was the wind rattling the tin sign hanging above the ticket office. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out his letter. Caleb, Judd, and Seth slowly did the same. 4 crumpled pieces of paper. "Your sisters," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. He sounded entirely disgusted. Cora didn't flinch. "We are." "The advertisements," Elias said slowly, measuring his temper, "were placed in 4 different states, 4 different names, 4 different return addresses. I paid a clerk in St. Louis $1 to mail them from different post offices down the line," Cora replied smoothly. She didn't look away from Elias. There was no apology in her face, just a grim, unyielding survival instinct. "We read the paper. We saw 4 men with the same last name in the same county looking for wives. I wasn't about to let my sisters be scattered to the wind in places where I couldn't reach them. You wanted 4 women who know how to work. You got them." Judd let out a low whistle. "We've been swindled by a flock of hens." "You haven't been swindled out of a damn thing," Abigail snapped, turning on Judd. "We paid our own train fare past Omaha. We're here. We're breathing. And unless you've got a mansion hidden out there in the scrub, I suggest you load these trunks. We're tired." Elias stared at Cora. He was furious. He didn't like being played. Out here, a man's word was the only currency that held its value. But as he looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, the frayed cuffs of her sleeves, and the way she stood slightly in front of the youngest, Lucy, like a human shield, his anger met something hard and practical. They were here. The money was spent. Winter was 2 months away. Elias shoved his letter back into his pocket. "Load the trunks," Elias ordered his brothers. He didn't offer his hand to Cora. She didn't look like she wanted it anyway. They brought 2 wagons. Elias and Caleb took the first. Judd and Seth took the second. Cora climbed up beside Elias on the buckboard. The wood was splintered and hot beneath her. She kept her spine perfectly straight. She had spent the last 2 months terrified of this exact moment. She had lied to these men. Out west, men shot each other over lesser offenses. But as she watched Elias flick the reins and cluck to the mules, she noticed his hands. They were scarred, the knuckles swollen. These were the hands of a man who fought the earth for a living. "You're angry," Cora said about 3 miles out of town. The silence had grown too heavy, thick with dust and unspoken accusations. "I don't like liars," Elias replied. He didn't look at her. "I did what I had to do," Cora said. "If you have a problem with it, you can put us back on the train. Assuming you have the fare." Elias finally slid his gaze toward her. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "I ain't got the fare, and you know it. That's why you risked it." He was right. Cora fell silent. She looked back over her shoulder. In the bed of the wagon, Abigail was seated on her trunk, her arms crossed, glaring at Caleb's back. Caleb had a thick, jagged scar running from his left ear down to his collarbone, pulling the skin tight. He hadn't spoken a single word to Abigail since they left the station. In the wagon behind them, through a haze of kicked-up dirt, Cora could see Jane gripping the side rail until her knuckles turned white. Judd was driving, smoking in silence. Only Seth and Lucy were exchanging words, though Cora couldn't hear them over the rattle of the wheels. The landscape was brutal. Flat stretches of yellow grass gave way to sharp, rocky foothills. There were no trees, just a massive, bruised sky pressing down on them. It felt like the edge of the world. 2 hours later, the Hale Ranch appeared. Cora's stomach plummeted. She hadn't expected a manor, but she had expected a farm. What sat in the shallow valley was a sprawling, low-slung log cabin that looked as if it had been built by men who hated geometry. A massive addition had been tacked onto the side, the wood still green and unweathered. A rickety barn leaned heavily to the right. Corrals made of twisted cedar branches held a few scrawny horses. There was no paint. There was no porch. It was a fortress against the wind, nothing more. The wagons pulled up to the front. The mules blew out exhausted breaths. Elias hopped down and tied off the reins. He stood by the wheel, looking up at Cora. "Welcome to the Promised Land," he said, his voice flat. Cora gathered her skirts and climbed down. She ignored the burn in her legs from the long ride. Abigail dropped down beside her, dusting off her dress with aggressive, angry swipes. "I've seen better outhouses in St. Louis," Abigail muttered. Caleb hauled Abigail's trunk over his shoulder. "Then you can sleep in the barn. It smells better than the house anyway." Abigail's eyes flashed. "Lead the way, then. I'm sure you're well acquainted with the hay." Caleb stopped dead in his tracks. He turned, the heavy trunk balanced easily on his shoulder. He looked at Abigail, really looked at her for the first time. Most women flinched at his scar. Most women looked away. Abigail was staring right at it, her expression caught somewhere between defiance and exhaustion. Caleb gave a short, humorless grunt and carried her trunk inside. The interior of the house was a cavern of rough-hewn logs and smelling of stale grease, old wood smoke, and unwashed men. The main room was dominated by a massive stone hearth. A scarred wooden table sat in the center, flanked by mismatched chairs. Through a doorway, Cora saw the new addition. 4 rooms hastily partitioned with thin plank walls. The doors were just heavy canvas curtains. "Rooms are back there," Elias said, tossing his hat onto a peg. "We built 'em last month. One for each couple." The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Jane stepped closer to Cora, her shoulder pressing against her sister's. Lucy looked nervously toward Seth. Cora took a breath. She had negotiated their survival this far. She had to set the rules for the rest of it. "Mr. Hale," Cora said, turning to Elias, "my sisters and I are accustomed to hard work. We will cook. We will clean. We will mend your clothes and tend your gardens. We will honor the vows we take when the preacher comes." She paused, her voice hardening. "But tonight we are exhausted. We will take 2 rooms. You and your brothers can figure out the rest. We lock our doors until the rings are on our fingers." Seth let out a harsh laugh. "Ain't got no doors to lock, sweetheart. Just canvas." "Then we will push the beds against the frames," Abigail snapped. Judd leaned against the door frame, amused. He struck a match on the heel of his boot and lit another cigarette. "Fair enough. Preacher only rides through on the first Sunday of the month anyway. You got 10 days to decide if you'd rather walk back to St. Louis." Elias didn't argue. He just stared at Cora. It was a terrifyingly calm stare. He saw the sheer panic operating beneath her ironclad posture. He saw a woman holding a crumbling wall together with her bare hands. "Fine," Elias said. "Caleb, take the trunks to the 2 rooms on the left. Judd, Seth, we take the right." The women didn't wait. They took their smaller bags and retreated into the dark, stifling rooms. Once the canvas dropped shut, Cora sat heavily on the edge of a straw-stuffed mattress. The springs groaned. Jane sat beside her, burying her face in her hands. "It's a prison, Cora," Jane whispered, her voice trembling. "It's a prison at the end of the earth." "It's a roof," Cora said fiercely, grabbing Jane's wrists and pulling her hands away from her face. "It's a roof, and it's meals, and it's far away from him. He can't find us here. Nobody can." In the next room over, through the thin planks, They could hear Abigail arguing with Caleb about where to set her trunk down. Cora closed her eyes. They had made it. They were here. But as she listened to the heavy, deliberate footsteps of Elias Hale walking across the floorboards in the main room, she realized the hardest part wasn't the journey. It was the survival. Out in the main room, Elias pulled a bottle of cheap whiskey from a cabinet. He poured 4 glasses and shoved them across the table to his brothers. "Well," Judd said, taking a sip and grimacing at the burn. "You wanted a wife, Elias. Looks like you brought home a general." Elias threw his whiskey back. It tasted like fire and dust. "She's got grit," Caleb muttered, rubbing his scarred jaw. "I'll give the tall one that. Ain't scared of my face." Seth grinned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "The young one looks like she's about to bolt at the first loud noise." Elias set his glass down. The sharp thud echoed in the quiet cabin. He looked toward the canvas curtains. 4 women, 4 sisters. They had outsmarted them, cornered them, and now they were living under the same roof. "They ain't bolting," Elias said quietly. His voice carried the weight of a man who understood desperation. "Women don't pull a trick like that unless the devil himself is chasing them. They're running from something, and they're planning to stay." Elias walked to the hearth, poking the dying embers with an iron. He watched the sparks fly up the chimney into the cold Montana night. He didn't know what the Brennan sisters were running from, but as he listened to the low murmur of their voices through the thin walls, he knew one thing for certain. The Hale Ranch would never be quiet again. The morning started at 4. Montana didn't care if you were a hardened rancher or a fugitive from St. Louis. The cattle needed feed, the water pumps needed priming, and the frost creeping over the grass demanded a fire in the hearth. Cora took the kitchen. It was an unmitigated disaster of cast iron and grease. She spent the first 3 days boiling lye soap and scrubbing down the walls. Elias let her work. He brought in split wood, dropping it heavily into the copper bin, and watched her out of the corner of his eye. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for help. When she burned her forearm on the stovepipe, she rubbed butter on it, wrapped it in a torn flour sack, and went back to kneading dough. "You're cutting the biscuits too thin," Elias said on the 4th morning, pouring a cup of black boiling coffee. Cora slammed the rolling pin down. Flour plumed into the air. "If I cut them thicker, the flour won't last the month. Unless you know how to harvest wheat out of frozen dirt, you'll eat them thin." Elias took a sip of his coffee. He didn't smile, but the hard line of his jaw softened. Fair point. It was the closest thing to an apology she would get. Outside, the dynamic was louder. Abigail had taken one look at the state of the tack room and declared Caleb a savage. Caleb, in turn, handed her a bucket of saddle soap and told her to earn her keep. They fought over everything. They argued over the proper way to oil a bridle, the right amount of grain for the mules, and the sheer stupidity of keeping chickens in a coyote-infested valley. But on the 6th day, a roan gelding spooked and pinned Caleb against the corral fence. The wood cracked under his ribs. Abigail didn't scream. She grabbed a pitchfork, vaulted the lower rail, and jabbed the tines hard into the dirt right under the horse's nose. The roan bolted, leaving Caleb gasping in the dust. Abigail dropped the pitchfork. She knelt beside him, her hands moving over his ribs with a rough, clinical efficiency. Caleb looked up at her. He waited for her eyes to dart to his scarred cheek. She didn't even glance at it. She was too busy pressing her fingers against his side. "Nothing's broken," she said, her voice tight. "But you're an idiot for turning your back on an unbroken horse." Caleb grunted, letting her pull him to his feet. Noted. He didn't let go of her arm right away. She didn't pull back. The quiet ones had a different rhythm. Judd was a man of long silences and constant motion. Jane was a ghost. She flinched when doors slammed. She shrank against the walls when the men walked past. Judd noticed. He stopped wearing his spurs in the house. He stopped dropping his heavy saddle on the porch boards. When he found her struggling to carry a sloshing bucket from the well, he didn't say a word. He just took the handle from her raw hands, carried it to the kitchen, and walked away to roll a cigarette. Lucy and Seth were the only ones who seemed aware of their youth. Seth was eager to impress. He showed off with the lariat, roping fence posts and stray dogs, trying to wring a laugh out of the youngest Brennan. Lucy gave him small, cautious smiles. She mended his shirts, sewing up the tears with tiny, meticulous stitches. But the tentative truce shattered on the 8th night. It started with a scream. It ripped through the cabin, raw and terrified. Elias was out of bed before he was fully awake, his hand wrapping around the grip of the Colt revolver on his nightstand. He kicked open his door. Judd and Seth were already in the main room, shirts off, boots unlaced. Caleb stood by the hearth, a rifle in his hands. The screaming came from the girls' side of the house. Judd didn't wait. He crossed the room in 3 strides and tore the canvas curtain back. Jane was thrashing on the narrow bed, her hands clawing at the woolen blanket, her eyes squeezed shut. "No! Please, Uncle Albert, no! Don't sell us!" Cora was kneeling on the floor, trying to pin Jane's arms down. Abigail stood in the corner, clutching a fireplace poker, her chest heaving. Lucy was curled into a ball at the foot of the bed, weeping silently. Judd stopped dead. He lowered his hands. "Jane," he said softly. Jane bolted upright. Her eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. She saw Judd standing in the doorway, a tall, shadowy figure of a man. She shrieked, scrambling backward until her spine hit the log wall, pulling her knees to her chest. Cora spun around. "Get out!" she hissed at Judd. "All of you, get out!" Elias stepped up behind Judd. He put a heavy hand on his brother's shoulder and pulled him back. They retreated to the main room, leaving the women alone. Nobody went back to sleep. An hour later, Cora walked out of the back rooms. She wore her thick wool dress. Her hair was down, falling in dark, heavy waves over her shoulders. She looked exhausted. She walked over to the table and sat opposite Elias. The other 3 brothers stood in the shadows near the stove. "Uncle Albert," Elias said. It wasn't a question. Cora stared at the knots in the wooden table. "Our father's brother. When our parents died of the fever, we were sent to him. He owns a textile mill in St. Louis. He also owns a massive gambling debt." She swallowed hard. Her voice was flat, stripped of all emotion. 2 months ago, his creditors came to the house. 3 men. They told him they'd take his mill, his house, and his legs if he didn't pay. Albert offered them a trade. 4 healthy young women. Debt forgiven. Seth swore softly in the dark. "We ran that night," Cora continued. "We had $40 saved between us. It wasn't enough to disappear in the city. They would have found us. So we looked for the furthest place a train could take us. We saw your advertisements. 4 men, 1 location. We bought the tickets and forged the letters." She finally looked up at Elias. "We aren't swindlers, Mr. Hale. We are refugees. If you turn us out, they will find us. We will work until our bones break. But please, do not send us back." The cabin was dead silent. The wind howled against the logs, rattling the shutters. Elias looked at Cora. He saw the iron in her spine, the sheer, terrifying will that had dragged 3 women halfway across the country to a cabin full of strangers. He didn't feel pity. Pity was useless out here. He felt profound respect. The preacher comes on Sunday, Elias said quietly. Nobody's sending you anywhere. Sunday brought a biting chill and a gray sky that promised early snow. Reverend Miller's buggy rattled into the yard just past noon. He was a small, dusty man who looked entirely too fragile for the frontier. He carried a worn Bible and a ledger. The brothers were waiting on the porch. They had shaved. They wore clean, pressed shirts that Lucy had spent the morning ironing. Elias stood by the railing, staring out at the rolling plains. The front door opened. The women stepped out. There were no white dresses. There was no lace. They wore their best traveling clothes, brushed free of dust. Cora stepped up beside Elias. Abigail stood next to Caleb. Jane, trembling slightly, took her place by Judd. Lucy stood with Seth. Elias looked down at Cora. Her jaw was set. "You don't have to do this," Elias said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're safe here. Vows or no vows, I give you my word." Cora looked up at him. She saw the truth in his rough, weathered face. He meant it. He would protect them without demanding payment. But Cora was tired of running. She was tired of living on borrowed time and the charity of strangers. She wanted a claim. She wanted a home. "I came here to be a wife, Elias," Cora said firmly. "Let's get it done." The Reverend didn't waste time on flowery sermons. He knew the nature of these unions. He stood on the dirt in front of the porch and opened his book. "Do you, Elias, take Cora?" The words washed over them. It was a transaction of survival turned into a sacred pact. When it came time for the rings, there was a brief hesitation. The Hale brothers hadn't bought rings. They hadn't thought that far ahead. Judd stepped forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 4 simple bands forged from horseshoe nails. He had spent the last 3 nights in the barn, hammering them out over the small anvil, filing the sharp edges down until the metal was smooth and dull. He handed one to each of his brothers. Jane looked at the crude iron ring Judd slipped onto her finger. It wasn't gold. It wasn't pretty. But it was heavy, and it was solid, and it felt like an anchor. She looked up at Judd. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't want to look away. "I pronounce you husbands and wives," the Reverend finished, snapping his book shut. "May God have mercy on this household." They didn't kiss. They just stood there. 4 newly forged couples, bound by ink, desperation, and iron nails. The Reverend accepted a hot meal, a silver dollar, and rode back out toward the settlement. Elias watched the buggy disappear over the ridge. The wind was picking up, carrying the sharp scent of snow. Winter was coming. The ground would freeze, the work would double, and they would be snowed in for months. Cora stepped up beside him. She crossed her arms against the cold. "We need to butcher the hogs before the first freeze," she said, her voice practical and steady. "And the roof on the addition needs more pitch." Elias turned to look at her. The wind whipped dark hair across her face. She wasn't a fragile thing needing saving. She was a partner. A general for the coming war against the winter. Elias reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing the hair back from her cheek. Cora went perfectly still. She didn't pull away. "We'll patch the roof tomorrow," Elias said softly. "Today you rest." From the barn, Caleb and Abigail were already arguing over the hay rationing. In the kitchen, Seth was making Lucy laugh at a badly told joke. On the porch, Judd was quietly showing Jane how to whittle a sparrow out of pine wood. The Hale Ranch was no longer just a fortress against the wind. It was a home, messy, loud, built on a foundation of lies, but forged in the unforgiving truth of the West. They had ordered sturdy hands to churn butter, they got a salvation they didn't know they needed. If you found yourself captivated by the grit, survival, and unexpected romance of the Brennan sisters and the Hale brothers, make sure to hit that like button. This is just one of many untamed frontier stories we have to tell. Share this video with someone who loves a truly grounded, deeply human Western drama. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on our next Wild West storytelling adventure. We'll see you on the next trawl.